Warsaw, winter, 1942. Before dawn paints the stone tenements blue, the city already groans. Another night of freezing wind. Another morning of occupation. Another roundup. The street outside the ghetto wall is a corridor of menace, German boots rhythmically crushing frost, truck engines idling like hungry animals, the metallic clatter of rifle bolts sliding home. And threaded through that mechanical brutality is a thin, human sound. Children crying somewhere behind brick and barbed wire. A Red Cross ambulance rolls forward, coughing exhaust into the pale light. Not a military vehicle, not a police wagon, just an unremarkable municipal medical van, white paint yellowing under years of cold. A German sergeant stomps forward, breath fogging around the rim of his helmet. "Inspection," he barks. Inside the ambulance, a woman in a worn coat and wireframe glasses lifts her face. She seems harmless, almost timid. Someone whose greatest weapon might be a clipboard. Her gloves are frayed. Her hair is pinned in the tired knot of an overworked nurse. Irena Sendler, municipal health inspector, social worker, or so the Nazis believe. She hands over her documents, steady as marble, medical pass, disease control authorization, ghetto entry permit. The sergeant flips through them with irritation. Bureaucracy is the only thing he hates more than cold. "Sanitation patrol?" he asks. "Yes," Irena replies softly. There are reports of typhus in the orphanages again. Typhus, the word the Germans fear more than saboteurs. Disease is the one enemy their guns cannot intimidate. The sergeant recoils slightly, then waves her through. The ambulance rumbles under the looming gate and into another world. Inside the Warsaw Ghetto, the air feels heavier. The smell strikes instantly. Smoke from makeshift stoves, unwashed bodies, rotting refuse, sickness. Snow mixes with ash on the ground. Children sweep past their legs like shadows, hollow-cheeked, running errands that once belonged to parents now missing. Adults line up at water pumps, their breath rising like ghosts fleeing their bodies. Irena moves with purpose, but not haste. Haste is suspicious. She smiles gently at the German guard posted near the gate, as though she genuinely believes today's mission is nothing more than bureaucratic drudgery. Yet every second is a razor pressed to her throat. She walks into a cramped tenement. A woman is waiting inside, eyes frantic, hands shaking, a toddler clutched at her hip. Behind her, a boy of 5 clings to the wall, too thin, too quiet. Irena kneels. "Is this him?" she whispers. The woman nods desperately. The boy is wearing 2 coats, one over the other, far too large. His shoes are mismatched, tied with string. His eyes, dark and enormous, never leave the door. He knows what happens when Germans open doors. Irena leans close, her voice barely audible. "Listen to me. When we go outside, you must not speak. Not a sound. Can you do that?" The boy nods. The woman presses something into Irena's hand. Trembling fingers. Last act of motherhood. A scrap of paper. The child's real name. Irena shakes her head. "No. You keep it. I'll write another." Because if she carries the note and gets caught, the boy is dead. And so is every child she has ever saved. She lifts the boy. He weighs less than the medical bag she carries. The mother's breath catches in her throat. A tiny break. The sound of soul tearing. "Will he remember me?" she asks. "He must forget you," Irena says. And this is the cruelty of rescue. Salvation built on erasure. She walks out. The boy hidden beneath her coat, like a smuggle flame. Back at the ambulance. 2 wooden crates are waiting. Sanitation supply boxes. The Germans have checked them already. Empty. Safe. Boring. But now, as Irena loads them, a faint sound emerges in the street. A German officer stepping toward her, boots echoing like distant gunshots. His eyes narrow. He does not know her, and unfamiliarity is dangerous. She forces a smile. "Be careful," she tells him in German. "We've had new typhus cases." He immediately steps back, covering his mouth with his glove. Fear of disease, her most reliable shield. She lowers the boy into the crate. He curls into a ball, silent as dust. She shuts the lid. A hollow click. A child's heartbeat now sealed inside wood. The officer watches, suspicious. What's in the box? Carrying contaminated linens out for burning, she replies calmly. If you like to open... No, he snaps, recoiling. Proceed. The ambulance doors close like the jaws of fate. A crate, a child, a nurse who isn't merely a nurse. A rescue happening in plain sight. This is a paradox. The most dangerous person in Warsaw is a woman who looks incapable of harm. The ambulance jolts forward. The boy's crate shifts with scraping wood. Irena's breath trembles only once, so quietly no one hears. She is already planning the next child, the next lie, the next coffin. She carries that rhythm with her like a second heartbeat. One life saved, then the calculation that always follows. Where place this child? What forged paper will convince a priest? Which aunt will risk taking a mouth to feed? Her municipal badge opens doors, but closes no mouths. Each exit from the wall is an equation. If I go, who notices? If I delay, who dies? If I succeed, how long until discovery? At the Municipal Social Welfare Department, she was the woman everyone underestimated. Small office, stacks of case files balanced like precarious towers. Her handwriting neat to the point of obsession. Her specialty? Children from poor families. Her reputation? Kind, persistent, a bit bookish. The kind of person who brought soup to work and forgot to eat it. Co-workers tease her for caring too much. She simply replied, if a child is cold, I bring a coat. If a mother is hungry, I bring bread. It is not complicated. She loved her city the way some people love gardens, believing it could always be tended, always be improved with enough hands. Warsaw was imperfect, but alive. Then September came, and the sky rained metal. German aircraft appeared over the city, like vultures circling a wounded animal. Sirens screamed. Buildings folded in on themselves. Smoke crawled upward in black pillars. Irena ran to the hospital corridors that day, helping drag patients into basement shelters, her lungs burning from dust. The world she knew cracked open, and something inside her cracked with it. When the occupation settled like a dark fog, she tried to continue her work. Welfare visits, social support, assistance for the sick. But everything was different now. The city's Jewish population, friends, co-workers, mothers she had helped for years, were suddenly forbidden from parks, buses, jobs, dignity. And then came the armbands. White cloth, blue Star of David, a mark meant to erase humanity. At first, Irena stayed cautious. She wrote letters, filed complaints, sent food quietly to Jewish families she had once assisted formally. Little acts of defiance, tiny sparks. Nothing heroic. Not yet. But occupiers do not tolerate sparks. They smother them with brutality. The moment the passive helper becomes a dangerous one. It happened on a wet afternoon in late 1940, when the Germans were fencing in what would become the Warsaw Ghetto. Workers hammered planks into place, while civilians watched helplessly. Irena had gone to visit a family she had supported for years, a mother named Rivka, a seamstress. Two daughters who always greeted Irena with mismatched drawings and sticky hands. But when she reached their building, soldiers were already there. A girl stood on the stoop, maybe 8 years old, her coat soaked through. She wasn't crying, just staring blankly ahead. Shock and silence even the smallest child. Irena knelt. "Where's your mama?" The girl didn't answer. She lifted a trembling hand and pointed. 2 German soldiers were dragging Rivka into the street. One laughed. The other struck her with the butt of a rifle when she stumbled, a sound like a wooden mallet hitting raw meat. "Please." Rivka cried. My children are alone." The soldier struck her again, and again, until the crying stopped. The little girl's hand dropped to her side. Irena stepped forward out of instinct, rage, horror, disbelief blending into something electric. A soldier pushed her back with a sneer. "Move, Polish swine." She felt the humiliation like a slap. But worse than that was a realization. No one else stepped forward. Everyone watched. Everyone feared. And fear, she understood in that moment, was becoming its own kind of collaborator. That was the snap, not the violence itself. Violence was everywhere under occupation. It was the silence that followed. A decision hardened inside her like cooling steel. If the world would not protect its children, she would. Even if it meant breaking every law. Even if it meant death. Even if it meant becoming a ghost operating behind the thinnest disguise, a social worker with nothing but paperwork and compassion. She looked down at the little girl again. Cold, alone, already motherless. "Come with me," she whispered. It was the first child she smuggled, the first false name, the first forged identity, the first step off the cliff. Because once she crossed that line, she could never return to safety, not while the walls rose higher around the ghetto, and the Germans began their slow, deliberate suffocation of a people. This was not work anymore. This was resistance, one child at a time. The city learned to live in whispers, and those whispers braided into routes and notes, and the soft rustle of hands passing danger like contraband. Warsaw in 1941 had two faces, one public, one hidden in the seams. The public face was the one the Germans allowed. Streets patrolled by soldiers, ration lines that never moved fast enough, markets where starvation priced everything. But behind that, underneath the fear, lived a network of hands passing notes, soup medicine warnings. At the center of one strand of that fragile web was a woman with a briefcase full of forged documents and a memory sharp enough to keep hundreds of new names alive in her mind. But to understand the scale of what she built, you have to picture the architecture of the ghetto itself. 400,000 souls packed into one. 3 square miles, surrounded by 10-foot walls topped with broken glass. The gates were choke points manned by German police and blue uniform collaborators, cold men who memorized faces as easily as they memorized license plates. To enter required authorization. To exit required either German approval or a miracle. Irena opted for the miracle. Yet miracles need planning. They need infrastructure. And infrastructure requires tools, dangerous tools. She started with ink, not ordinary ink. The Germans use a specific blue-black formula in their official stamps, a shade just slightly different from a common type sold in stationery shops. Irene acquired some of the real stuff by bribing a junior clerk at the municipal offices. A single vial, enough to reproduce the fingerprint of authority. With it, she could make passes that looked correct at a glance. But passes were only part of the puzzle. The Germans had stamps, emblems with the Reichsadler eagle, codes for departments, dates arranged in precise concentric rings. To forge one, she needed access to the original. That opportunity came disguised as tedium. During a routine inspection at a German-run infirmary, she noticed a stack of documents on a desk. At the top, a rubber stamp with the official seal of the Gesundheitsamt. She asked the attending officer to retrieve a file from a different room, a long shot, a bluff of bureaucratic expectation. The officer hesitated, annoyed, but Irena had perfected a posture, spine cautious, chin lowered, voice deferential. A woman too small to be a threat, too overwhelmed by procedure to deviate from it. The officer went to fetch the file. The moment he left, she palmed the stamp, pressed it quickly onto a sheet of blotting paper she'd hidden in her sleeve, capturing the design, mirror reverse of course, but enough to replicate. She slid the blotting paper into her coat and returned the stamp exactly where it had been. Seconds later, the officer returned. She thanked him. He never looked twice. That sheet of blotting paper was the beginning of an industrial-scale forgery operation. But while documents could open gates, they could not carry children. That required a different kind of ingenuity. Her municipal job gave her access to spaces the Germans treated with caution. Hospitals, quarantine centers, and most importantly, sanitation routes. Typhus terrified the occupiers. They believed disease spread through Jewish populations like wildfire, and they wanted nothing to do with it. Any worker handling contaminated linens or supplies often passed checkpoints with minimal inspection. So Irena created the illusion of contagion where she needed it. She carried small vials of carbolic acid, sharp-smelling, unmistakable. A dab on cloth produced a stench that suggested infection. She would wave a bundle toward the guards. watched them recoil, and walked through without a second glance. Within the ghetto, she made allies, teachers, nurses, priests, orphanage workers. Not many, just enough. A handful of brave souls who agreed to help smuggle children out. They met in cramped apartments behind shuttered windows, whispered over maps drawn on scraps of ration paper. The routes varied. One, through a courthouse that straddled both sides of the wall, a judge's corridor, a maintenance hatch, a blind spot in the guard's rotation. Two, through the sewer system, waist-deep in freezing water, carrying infants wrapped in oilcloth to keep them from drowning. Three, through the main gate, hidden in toolboxes, potato sacks, ambulances. Four, and the most infamous method, inside coffins used for disease victims. Germans rarely opened them. The fear of typhus did the work for her. But each route carried its own death sentence if discovered. To organize this growing network, she needed someone she could trust completely. Enter Dr. Janusz Korczak, the orphanage director, beloved by children, despised by the occupiers for refusing to abandon them. He met Irena in the hallway of his orphanage, lit only by a candle because the electricity had been cut again. The walls were lined with children's drawings, flowers, trees, dreams that no longer existed. "You understand what you're asking," Korczak said quietly, his face gone from rationing. "To take them away from everything they know. And if we don't..." Irena asked, "What future do they have here?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew the rumors, deportations to the east, entire families vanishing after boarding trains. Korczak pressed a hand against the wall, steadying himself. "If you take them," he whispered, "you must promise something." "What?" "That you will remember their names." "I'll remember every one," she said. She would keep that promise by writing each child's real identity on thin strips of paper, sealing them inside jars, and burying those jars beneath an apple tree in a friend's garden. If the war ended and the parents returned, she would reunite them. If not, the children would at least know who they were. This was not a resistance operation. This was a resurrection. But every heist movie, every act of deception, needs an antagonist, a force that adapts, sharpens, and hunts. His name was SS Obersturmführer Karl Eberhard Muller. Tall, angular, with narrow hawk's nose and eyes that remained fixed a beat too long when appraising people. He had been transferred from Krakow after exposing a network smuggling adults through fake work permits. He considered himself an expert in reading guilt, body language, eye movements, irregular breathing. He liked catching liars. He took pride in it. When he arrived in Warsaw, he walked the ghetto gate with predatory stillness, examining every worker entering and exiting. It didn't take him long to notice the quiet Polish nurse with too many privileges, too much access, too many reasons to be inside the walls. The first time he asked for her papers, he did it politely. The second time, he did it coldly. The third time, he did it violently, snatching the document from her hand, inspecting her face as though memorizing it to find the moment it would break. "What exactly do you do in there?" he asked. "Health inspections," she replied. "You go in often. There is much illness." He stepped closer. "Or much opportunity to hide something." Irena held her breath for 1 second. Then she allowed her shoulders to sag slightly as though cowed, intimidated, as though he had already won. Men like Muller fed on dominance. Giving it to him disguised the danger. He flicked her papers back at her. "Next time, bring a full itinerary of your inspection route." She nodded, though she had no intention of doing any such thing. From that moment, Muller became a shadow at her back. Each time she approached the gate, she scanned for him. Each time she loaded a crate, she wondered if his eyes were somewhere watching. Each time she forged a signature, she imagined his hand pinning the page down in interrogation, demanding explanation. She adapted, adjusted routes, swapped shifts with other workers, changed insignia on her coat, spread misinformation about typhus outbreaks, so convincing that German officers refused even to enter certain buildings, unknowingly giving her open corridors to move children through. But Muller was patient. He didn't need to catch her today. He only needed her to make one mistake. And the operation grew. A toddler sedated gently so he wouldn't cry as he was carried out beneath blankets. A girl disguised as a Christian orphan, clutching a rosary she didn't understand. Siblings separated for survival, promising through tears that they would find each other after the war. One night, a father pressed his forehead to Irena's hand. "You are stealing my children," he whispered. "Yes." "Then thank you." The line between salvation and theft blurred, but the alternative was Treblinka. By 1942, her network had extracted over 1,000 children. The jars beneath the apple tree multiplied like buried treasure, each containing a name, a memory, a testament to a life still clinging to possibility. But success as a scent, and Mueller could smell it. Reports crossed his desk, missing infants, undocumented children appearing in Catholic orphanages, forged baptism records with identical handwriting. He circled names, underlined dates, followed patterns. Always, the same municipal worker appeared. He began tailing her. Once, as she left the ghetto at dusk, pushing a handcart filled with what appeared to be dirty laundry, she felt something. Not sound, not sight, but instinct, the sense of the predator pacing behind. She glanced back. Mueller stood beneath a street lamp, cigarette glowing like a malevolent eye. He exhaled smoke slowly, watching her the way a hunter watches the trembling of underbrush before the deer bolts. Irena forced herself not to quicken her pace, not to look away too fast, not to betray anything. The hand carts will creak with every rotation, a tiny mechanical scream. Inside the layers of laundry lay a baby, breathing shallow, barely moving. She passed Mueller with a faint smile. "Good evening," her Obersturmführer. His gaze dipped to the cart. "Laundry?" "Yes." "For the incineration." He stepped closer. Another step. Another. The baby coughed. Irena's heart didn't stop. No, worse. It stuttered in her chest like an engine misfiring. A sound so soft it might have been wind. But Mueller heard everything. "What was that?" he asked. She shook her head. "Nothing." Mueller bent down. Time fractured into shards. Her throat tightened. Her fingers dug into the cart handle, so hard the knuckles whitened. She prepared herself, the arrest, the beating, the confession that would torture out of her. Then Mueller recoiled sharply. "Disgusting," he spat. "This laundry is crawling with lice." Carbolic acid. She had soaked the top sheet with it earlier. He stepped away, wiping his hands. "Take it to the furnace." She bowed her head and walked. Inside the cart, the baby's chest rose and fell with fragile breaths. One more life smuggled past the jaws of death. But Mueller was circling closer. Her forgery ring was too effective. Her frequency of visits too high. Her excuses too consistent. The net was tightening. And the war was entering a new phase, one where the ghetto's liquidation loomed, where every child still trapped inside faced the same fate. She could not slow down. She could not step back. To hesitate meant death. To continue meant exposure. She chose exposure. The operation accelerated into overdrive. More night crossings. More forged documents. More hidden children drugged with tiny drops of barbiturates, so they wouldn't cry during transit. The sewer routes became highways of desperation. Rescue teams moved in silence, stepping carefully around the bones of earlier victims washed into the tunnels. Through it all, Irena kept her cover intact with one weapon more powerful than any forged pass: the enemy's underestimation of her. Every day she walked into the ghetto carrying medicine and paperwork. Every day she walked out carrying the future of families who would never know her name. Every day she risked everything under the watchful gaze of a man who lived to expose lies. The slow-motion collision between them was inevitable. It came not with a gunshot, but with a knock on her door. Heavy, official, final. Mueller had made his move, and now the real test would begin. The knock at the door was not a knock at all. It came like a verdict. 3 blows that rattled the cups in her kitchen cabinet and sent a new kind of cold sliding through the thin walls of her apartment. Dawn had not yet found the streetlights. Windows were still dim with sleep. For a woman who had learned to measure danger by the smallest sounds, this one carried the shape of inevitability. Irena stood barefoot on the cold floorboards and listened with the tight attention of someone who has practiced being patient in the jaws of fate. Her pulse thrummed at the base of her throat. For an instant she allowed herself a small, private hope that the sound might be a mistake, a neighbor's heavy foot. Then she opened the door. Carl Muller filled her hallway like a shadow made flesh, flanked by two men in black coats whose boots chewed the threshold as if it were theirs by appetite. He did not smile. He did not need to. His face was a blade honed on routine cruelty. Fräulein Sendler, he said, voice flat as an order. A moment of your time. One of the Gestapo stepped inside before she could answer. Another followed. Muller moved as if entering a drawing room, casual, taking in her books, her plain curtains, the stack of municipal forms on the table. Each ordinary thing might be a secret, every shelf a potential noose. She folded her hands to keep them from trembling and forced a little steadiness into her voice. What is this about? He shrugged with the ease of a man who believed all questions bent to his will. A minor administrative matter. Protocol. He tapped the back of a chair with two fingers, listening for hollow spots as though the apartment itself might be lying. Your entry logs for Ghetto. A paper slid across the table, like a trap sprung. Her breath tightened. The logs were supposed to be banal, a ledger of dull inspections and routine complaints. They were, by design, meant to be forgettable, except in the margin of one page of date a line wrong. A signature hurried. One of those tiny human mistakes that can be fatal in a bureaucracy built to kill. Muller watched her for that single human twitch, that tiny confession in the eyes. She allowed her shoulders to slump a fraction, enough to appear cowed, not enough to be defeated. A clerical error, she offered. I handled dozens of files. He smiled as though she had given him a gift. One might call it sloppy. The word landed like a stone. He leaned forward, fingertips pressed together. Fräulein Sendler, I think you've been entering the ghetto for reasons other than sanitation. Such as, her voice remained small, practice to be unthreatening. Smuggling, he said. The syllables sliced the room. Children. It was a detective's delight, the notion that the harmless woman could be the clever thief. Behind them, one of the officers shifted his weight, hand resting on the butt of a pistol. Muller reached into his coat and produced a small wooden rattle, the lacquer worn down where tiny fingers had clung to it. He set it on the table as if presenting evidence in a pleasant trial. A toy found in a pile of linens you delivered for incineration last month, he said. No child found with it. Either the child died, or the child was removed. The world narrowed to the click of his words. She felt the color drain from her face, but not the courage. You are mistaken. The answer lay in the steadiness of a person who had practiced denials so many times they had become prayer. He shrugged, an active board awaiting. Arrest her? Hands, like iron, closed on her arms. The chair toppled behind her. She did not scream. There was no point. The apartment blurred as they hauled her into the stairwell, where cold light carved hard lines through dust. The car that waited outside smelled of oil and tobacco, and the kind of certainty that ends lives. They shoved her in, and the engine swallowed her. Muller sat opposite, casual as a man telling a story. I admire your type, he said conversationally, as if offering tea. Idealists. You cling to the illusion that one person can change the tide of war. But ideals don't survive interrogations. The interrogation room was gray in every way. Walls, table. The single bulb that spat a thin light and threw shadows like knives. The air smelled of stale tobacco, bleach, and the sweat of men who spent their days making other people break. They tied her to a chair. The rope bit into her wrists, a hot, sharp reminder that the body was merely a vessel. Muller entered with the patience of a connoisseur. He removed a notebook and began with small questions that grew teeth. Who helped you? Where are the children? Where are the lists? He hit her with methods that were deliberate and cold. Gloves across ribs, sharp but measured, kicks to stubborn knees. A heel to the shin that folded the breath from her chest. Between strikes, a voice like syrup. Tell us the names. She tasted copper in her mouth. The first blow of the fight, not with weapons, but with memory. She kept returning the same answer like a mantra. I know nothing. Because any crack would be an ember they could follow burn 1,000 other lives. They measured the silence like commodity and found it wanting. When the blows took a toll on the bones, they moved to a crueler economy of pain. A snap in her leg. The world refracted into unbearable light. Then another. The sound of bone breaking is a sound that removes language. Her knees went out from under her, and she collapsed, breath racked. Everything narrowed to white fire and the iron tang of fear. Muller knelt beside her, voice suddenly soft, coaxing. "Tell me where the lists are. The jars. The apple tree." She spat blood on the floor rather than betray them. The question had an arithmetic to it. Names could be counted, jars could be dug, families could be torn apart. 2,000 children were not a number to be given up for the sake of saving herself. They drag her out hours later, what might have been hours or days. Time gets chewed in Gestapo basements. Her legs broken and patched in the way men patch things they intend to throw away. Outside, a firing squad waited, as if rituals could tidy the arithmetic of murder. The officer read a paper aloud, a sentence constructed in bureaucracy to sound legal. Sentenced to death for aiding Jews. They offered the blindfold, and she refused it. If the world condemned her, she would look at it while it did. Rifles were raised. The cold wrapped around her like a cloak, and she felt how small a human body can be in the face of state machinery. Then a whistle, sharp, incredulous, cut the morning. A young officer appeared, waving papers. "Hold," he cried. Men who make their living with certainty needed to be reassured by paperwork. A forged slip that radiated authority was enough to startle them into obedience. "Orders from Berlin," he said, and the rifles lowered. It was a lie written with care and bought with the fragile currency of bribes and the risk of others who still moved like ghosts within the machine. The resistance had forged a signature, or bribed a clerk, or both. They had marked her as executed on the rolls, a bureaucratic corpse. They threw her into a ditch to make the theater real. In the dark cloak of night, hands, warm and trembling, pulled her out. They carried her to a safe house, to an attic that smelled of yeast and dust and the kind of pity that refuses to leave even when danger presses close. Pain was a constant, raw companion, and yet the first words she asked upon waking were not about herself. "The lists?" she croaked. "They're safe," a courier promised, bending close with a face half hidden. "The jars are buried under the apple tree." She closed her eyes and allowed herself a single small breath that did not feel like theft. The graves of truth, glass jars sealed and sunk beneath soil, still held the strands that tied children back to the lives they had been born into. She pictured the thin strips of paper abraded by earth, the names curling, the letters almost indecipherable but meant to outlast war. Recovery was slow and stoic. Bones knit in crooked ways. The limbs that had once marched through gates to steal futures now ached with every movement. She learned to stand with crutches, to walk with cane, to hide the limp with the practiced posture of a woman who knew the price of visibility. The Germans thought she was a corpse. The city thought she was dead. That fiction became her armor. From the shadow of the supposed dead, she continued to orchestrate rescue. Maps whispered across the table. Forged baptismal certificates distributed under the candlelight. Routes timed to the rhythm of patrols. Her network moved children through every hole in the city's armor. Some were hidden in the hollows of convent attics, nuns tucking infants into pillowcases and murmuring prayers that smelled faintly of vinegar. Others were placed with farmers who fed them potatoes and milk and lied when their neighbors asked if they'd taken in a child. Some passed through the subterranean arteries of the sewer system where men waist-deep in freezing water ferried infants wrapped in oilcloth like contraband of the most precious kind. Some, most dangerously, were laid in coffins, those instruments of fear no guard wanted to open because the smell of carbolic or typhus convinced even the cruelest that disease was a thing to be avoided. She kept the jars beneath the apple tree, not as trophies, but as promises. Each slip of paper inside a jar held a name, a birth date, a mother's cry rendered into ink. When the war ended, the task that awaited her was not repose, but the cruel arithmetic of reunion, matching names to faces, calling out letters like litany, seeing joy swallow grief and grief swallow joy. She dug in the cold earth with fingers stiff and aching and laughed once, a small cracked sound, as glass met dirt and sheets of paper, yellowed with time, slipped back into light. By then the city was a skeleton, windows like broken teeth, the streets littered with the small debris of life. That cup, that shoe. She hobbled among ruins, leaning on the cane, not because she sought pity, but because the bones would not lie. 2,500 children had been smuggled out. Of those, only a fraction ever found the parents who had birthed them. Some arrive at reunions with blank pages where family histories should be. Some match with mothers who recognize children by songs and not by faces. Some did not find anyone and carried two lives inside them, one given, one taken. Offers of medals came and she pushed them away. The world had little use for humility, and she had exactly none to spare. "I only did what had to be done," she said, and in those words there was a sorrow that did not beg understanding. She refused the spotlight because the work required obscurity. Her reward lay in the lives multiplied, in doctors and teachers whose grandchildren would be born because a social worker had known how to hide a name inside a jar. Years later, long after the city had stopped shuddering at the sight of foreign helmets, a journalist asked what had driven her. She closed her eyes and saw the girl on the stoop. The seamstress struck on the cobbles. The boy curled inside a crate, the soft cough that almost unmade them all. "If you see a drowning person," she said softly, "you jump into the water, even if you cannot swim." Then, softer still, and sometimes a drowning person is a child you've never met. She died in 2008, 98 years old, having outlived the men who assumed compassion was weakness. The children she saved grew into lives that were ordinary in their ordinariness. Teachers, doctors, mothers, fathers, each carrying the quiet beginning of a story that had been scooped from the jaws of a system determined to erase them. The jars remain like a testament. Fragile, stubborn, simple glass preserving names like prayers. The enemy mistook the woman who carried lists for a harmless bureaucrat. They mistook kindness for naivety. They never understood that the softest voices can be the sharpest weapons, that the careful hands who file paperwork can also hide the future of people. The paradox was the point. The most dangerous person in Warsaw was the one who looked least like a soldier. She carried no arms. She carried children.